All right, welcome everyone. Good morning. Welcome to another episode of our ongoing Equity Gap Micro Summit series. This is being presented to you by the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, Council on Communities of Color. Many of you have been joining us over the course of pandemic, in some ways, fortunately, because we get to come together and talk about these very important issues, but also unfortunately, because they're very serious issues, many worsened by pandemic. But that's why we're bringing you these Equity Gap, these very important and essential Equity Gap Micro Summit series. This latest installment on remote learning, is it just for pandemic or is it the future, is also being done in partnership with, being powered by K-12 Incorporated. So we absolutely appreciate K-12's participation and partnership, making this Equity Gap Micro Summit series episode possible. I'm Charles Ellison. How are you all doing? I'm your host, moderator, executive producer of this Equity Gap Micro Summit series. Also, we have on the back end, behind the shadows, but making all of this possible, Debbie-Ann Page. She is director of the Council on Communities of Color at the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference. You want to go to csg-erc.org for more information on the council and the work, the good work that they're doing, the good work of all of their member state legislators throughout the Eastern region, and definitely appreciate the fantastic work that Debbie always does, and she's making this all possible. And you know, we're all here in this virtual environment because of her. These are open to the public. These micro summits are also recorded. They will be provided at a later point, almost immediately, on a number of digital and also radio broadcast platforms, including my daily public affairs program, Reality Check, on WURD. That's daily from Mondays through Thursdays, 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern, WURDradio.com. It's based in Philadelphia. I'm also based in Washington, D.C. We broadcast from the nation's capital. We go into a number of major political and public policy issues each day. We unpack that, but Fridays we are off, and then I do Equity Gap Micro Summit series. So today we're talking about remote learning. Everyone's been talking about that. Everyone has been experiencing that, particularly if you have young people, if you have students who are in school, K through 12, they are more than likely in some sort of remote learning environment. In some states, there may be a hybrid approach that's been activated where it's a blend of limited in-class sessions, but also remote learning. But with pandemic still there, and in some cases worsening, it's completely remote learning in most states right now. So we're going to talk about that and offer some, you know, not just some insights into what this means right now in pandemic, and also what this means for the future, but also to help you all navigate this as experts, advocates, policymakers, help you navigate this, this very unique time that we're in, and this very unique technology. But the technology is really not all that old, is it? No, it really isn't. Remote learning, online learning has been around for quite some time, and we'll talk about that. So we're gonna introduce our panelists right now. We've got an esteemed group of panelists. One of our panelists should be joining us shortly, but let's just go ahead and get this started. We have Senator Elizabeth Lockman. She is a member of the Delaware General Assembly, representing parts of Wilmington, Delaware, just outside of Philly, where I grew up and where I'm also on radio. It was good to have her on. Thank you, Senator, for joining us. We're also we're scheduled to have State Representative Brandon Mcgee with the Connecticut General Assembly, also Vice Chair of the Connecticut Black Legislative Caucus there. Also joining us is Kevin P. Chavis. He is a former council member of the Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia City Council, but he is now president of Academics, Policy, and Schools at K-12 Incorporated, our partner for today's Micro Summit. So go to k12.com for more information there. Frank Gettridge, Dr. Frank Gettridge, is Executive Director of the National Public Education Support Fund, and Jamila Newman is a partner with the New Teacher Project, TNTP. So for more information on the National Public Education Support Fund, npesf.org, and for the New Teacher Project, tntp.org. Also, I'm on social media at Ellison Report, hashtag reality check. Feel free to leave any questions or comments there on this program. You will, in about a half an hour, about 30 minutes, have an opportunity to submit questions in the Zoom group chat to the lower right-hand corner of the screen. So feel free to do so, and I'll present those questions during our conversation. Also, you can get more information and you can watch this video later on at the B-Note, thebenote.com. That's the companion hybrid magazine newsletter to Reality Check on WURD. So let's go ahead and get this started. I want to start with you, Senator. When we're thinking about remote learning, right, online learning, what comes to mind for you, and how are your constituents handling it? I mean, you're in Wilmington, that's the major city in Delaware.
It is. It's Delaware's largest.
Exactly, it's Delaware's largest city. It's in a major metropolitan area. This is a very unique time for your constituents. How are they handling this? How are they handling remote learning? What aspects of it are standing out for you?
Sure. Well, first I'll just say good morning, Charles, and good morning to all my esteemed fellow panelists and everyone who's here. It's really an honor to be here. My first impression in terms of our rapid transition to an almost universal remote learning environment is that it's a mixed bag, obviously. We have some really exciting and innovative things that are happening in some of our schools and for many of our students, but probably the aspects of it that have become the most present for me are where we're falling short. We have a lot of constituents in my district who fall into a lower income bracket, who live in struggling communities and are dealing with issues of housing instability and unemployment and underemployment and all these types of things that we're all very familiar with, particularly in our communities of color, who are really struggling to connect with the tools and with the consistency they need to really thrive in a remote learning environment. So we're still trying to close a lot of those gaps. We've seen some great moves being made, I think, by some of our government agencies and our community groups in trying to close those, but we're still seeing folks really just in sort of a shock mode. And we're only a month in, but we have some school districts that have really pulled everything together. And then we have other school districts that haven't even managed to deliver devices to all of their students. So we happen to have a particularly unique situation whereas the city, we are split into multiple local education agencies, multiple districts. So we get to kind of compare and contrast different practices and ways that they meet student needs. So we are seeing a very mixed bag right now. My daughter is a senior at one of our charter schools that's staying completely virtual until January. And of course, she's a teenager. She is self-contained and they have a school where they don't have as many students with challenges. And so they've just sort of breezed right into it. It's really amazing to see some of the things they're doing. But my concern is some of those schools and families across town who are, they don't even have the laptop. They're still on packets, and that's how they're doing their remote learning. And so a lot of different things, and the inequities seem to be heightened.
No, thank you for that. Thanks for sharing that. We're going to go to, I do see Representative Brandon Mcgee. He is chair of Connecticut's legislative Black and Puerto Rican caucus there in the state of Connecticut. And I believe you're representing parts of Hartford, if I have that correct, Representative. Correct. And so share with us some of your experiences right now with remote learning, how you're also seeing it, how you're defining it, how you've seen it evolve during this pandemic. What are constituents saying?
Absolutely, and thank you for this opportunity to weigh in on such an important issue. I represent Hartford and the town of Windsor, and it's been an honor. So again, thank you for this opportunity on a subject that I say is near and dear to my heart as a father and as a legislator who's heard from many of my constituents about the challenges of learning remotely during the time of COVID-19. Stay safe, stay home was our mantra of our state's government's unparalleled response throughout these many months of social distancing. And we owe a lot of credit to strong leadership right here in Connecticut, especially my colleagues within the Black and Puerto Rican caucus. But as many of you or many of us know, not all homes are safe, healthy, or rather have any healthy environments for school-age kids to learn and to grow. Certainly providing education and opportunity at the click of a button is unimaginable just decades ago. But to some in the present, we know that access to such technology is far, far from universal. As my colleague just mentioned, many of our families still haven't received a laptop. So an aspect that must be central to any conversation, we know that access to technology is important. And so the pandemic for me has, and for others, has exacerbated many of the underlying inequities faced by working class and the low income families in the state of Connecticut. Areas like housing, a committee that I chair, healthcare, labor, and education were all flashpoints that members of the Black and Puerto Rican caucus took on during our teletown halls, which garnered close to millions of views and comments from hundreds across the state, crying out, asking for help. We need help when you begin talking about remote learning for our children. So much of this fight for equity more broadly begins with education. And again, I'm so glad to be a part of this conversation. But with it, we can provide increased opportunities, create pathways to economic mobility, and cut into what we know as the school to prison pipeline. The other evening, I had an opportunity to sit and watch my niece, who is, she's home and she's looking at the computer. And I says, well, what are you doing? She's like, well, I'm waiting for my teacher to give me access to participate in the class. There was an hour that had gone by and she's still sitting there. And I'm like, well, what are you doing? She's like, I'm just still waiting. I don't know what's going on. So I'm not here to beat up our educators because they're faced with many challenges. But there's something to be said about the challenges that many of our young people and families are faced with. So again, I'll leave it there and thank you for this opportunity.
No, thank you for that, Representative. Thanks for sharing that. Really appreciate you both kind of sharing the experiences that your constituents, residents, and your respective districts are going through. Councilman or Kevin, what are you saying in terms of how, because this is an unprecedented level of deployment for the model, the tools that K-12 uses and sells and also deploys for a number of districts. So what's that evolution look like throughout the course of pandemic? How are you all, I mean, as you're listening to the legislators here describe what their constituents, their residents are going through, especially some of the vulnerable low income, primarily Black students and some brown too, how is a company, how is a model like K-12 adapting to that?
Well, thank you, Charles. And first of all, I want to commend Senator Lockman, Representative Mcgee. I see there are other elected officials that are listening in. I've been there. I'm a recovering politician. So and I understand what you're going through day to day. I represented parts of Southeast and Northeast DC, which has some tremendous and some challenged communities, as you know, Charles. And in listening to Senator Lockman talk about sort of this mixed bag, that's exactly what's going on. And let me just share a bit about K-12, just for those who don't know. We are the largest online education provider in the country. We're in 33 states. Last year, we had 120 some odd thousand students. This year, we'll have 50 to 60,000 more when we announce our count next week. I had 6,000 teachers working for me. We put out a call indicating we were hiring 1,300 teachers last month. We'll probably get close to 8,000 teachers working for us. We've been working with HBCUs, a lot of African-American educators. So if you're a teacher out there, if you know teachers that want to learn how to operate online, teach online, we very much are looking to grow diversity as much as possible. In terms of our student mix, we have a little bit of everything. I say that our schools are probably as representative or more representative of America than any other school district. We have a larger than normal number of kids who are self-starters, so-called talented and gifted, and they work at their own pace. We have athletes. You know, one of our students in our Colorado school won the bronze medal in snowboarding in the Winter Olympics. We have a lot of kids who have special needs, a larger than normal number, and we have a growing number of kids who are academically, economically, and socially at risk. In fact, we offer readiness tests at the beginning of the year, and only 15%, 15% of our first-time enrolled K-12 students are at grade level. So when Representative Mcgee talks about these challenges, we live that every day because of the kids we serve. So the real, I think, takeaway I would give to the listeners who have recognized and seen the challenges. And by the way, we work with about 2,000 of the 14,000 school districts in America, either through our schools that we stand up. We work with charter schools, work with school districts, but with school districts, we provide curriculum, we provide teaching, training, and the like. It has been a mixed bag. And the big takeaway is that emergency remote learning is not the same as virtual learning administered by people who know what they're doing. We've been doing this 20 years. And for those elected officials and those who are parents, there are 3 things you need to make sure you talk with your school districts about to ensure they're on top of. You know, and before you get those 3 things, I think that as an elected official, you should talk to them about emergency preparedness or planning going forward. There will be another pandemic, a hurricane, a shooting, God forbid. There's going to be something that could impact on kids being able to go to school every day on time. So emergency planning is important. And those 3 things are, first, teacher training. A great teacher in a brick and mortar classroom can be a great teacher in an online setting, but you must have the training. You must understand how to use the tools, group kids in class connect sessions. You need to be able to figure out how to engage those kids who are otherwise engaged. All of those are skills and tools you just can't get by Xerox and PDFs and sending them home. You must have teacher training, and I think school districts need to invest in that. Secondly, you know, and we hear this a lot from school districts, they don't have adaptable curriculum. Textbooks are usually what schools have in brick and mortar, but in order to have an engaging experience for students, you must have a curriculum that you can adapt and use online, and teachers know how to navigate and use the tools to make it work more effectively. And that requires some level of investment. And the third thing that's equally important is a secure, robust platform. Many school districts are talking about outages or they've been subject to hackers. And that is a big challenge when you don't have a platform that can handle the load and also is not easily accessible for families. So I think those are the 3 main areas, and there's so many things flow from that in terms of parent engagement, which we can talk about, supporting families who don't have computers. I mean, by the way, last thing I'll say before we move on, Charles, is that with every kid that signs up in our program, we send them a laptop. We send them the materials. We do learning coach. The parent who works with the child is called a learning coach. We have Learning Coach University. So we help train those families on how to operate, because many of the families, because so many of them are at risk, many of the families we send computers to, the first computer they've ever had in their life are the ones we send to them. So I think that the school districts can get there. They have to have the planning, and they also have to be intentional about meeting families where they are. And there are those, the good news, and I think Senator Lockman alluded to this, is there are those school districts that are doing it, but those that aren't, we all have to help push them.
Got it. Yeah, I'm going to go to you, Frank, as far as like that, and Jamil, I want to have you chime in on this as well. Frank, you know, I hear a lot about how teachers, educators adapting to this new environment. You and I have talked about this before too on WRD, on Reality Check. And so how is that going? What are you hearing, and what do they need to do, especially based off those recommendations that you just heard from the councilman about, like, you know, he's kind of the expert in that space. And I mean, is that useful? Is that useful information for teachers in trying to adapt to this unprecedented, very peculiar, and very highly technical environment?
Thank you, Charles, and I want to appreciate my colleagues, and I agree with all of the points that they made. And we partner a lot at NPESF with education foundations to work with policymakers, and hear a lot of those voices that's coming from the community to discuss some of these challenges and figure out ways we can use our philanthropic dollars to improve the conditions for the families. But I would agree, but I'll just say from my own experience as a principal and as a teacher, that the paradigm shift around how that takes place. Because I agree that teachers need training, but sometimes in school districts, the form of training comes in the form of accountability. And so I think when we talk about what we need to do to support teachers, assessments and evaluations need to focus on support, and it needs to focus on growth. And so that's taking a different look at how we deal with this situation. I think I shared with you before, you know, teachers are still struggling with the pay gap. You have over 50% of teachers that have to work more than one job to make ends meet. You have teachers that still spending money out of their own pockets. And this was before the pandemic, to have supplies for their classrooms. And now it's taking on another turn. Teachers have children. I often say we forget about that. And so now that you have this remote learning happening at home, we have to consider some of the challenges that teachers have, and we have to rethink the investment that we're providing to teachers at this moment. So I would agree with everything that's being said, but I would just say the shift that needs to happen in this environment and the opportunity that we have is to move away from a space of accountability to improvement and think about it as a way of support to improvement.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Jamila? Thank you for that, Frank. What do you think, Jamila? And you wrote about this recently at tntp.org about making distance learning, remote learning better. And so how do we make it better? Because it just seems like most school districts, most parents, most households still haven't found a rhythm yet. This is something that's very, if you have a student or a child that has not been doing online learning or doing something of a blended approach of homeschooling, using an online learning module pre-pandemic, this is still something really difficult to get used to, but how do we make it better?
I think that's a great question. Before I even talk about like making remote learning better, I think it's important that we within the educational system and beyond, within the larger community that supports the educational system, start from the place of recognizing that even before the pandemic, the education, in my way of thinking, was in a state of emergency. And so when I talk about where we were in the spring and where we are now, I use a lot of medical terms. Like Kevin mentioned, we were in a triage state. We were putting Band-Aids on things because we were just trying to figure out how to move forward, how to get it to a place of stability, but not necessarily care and health. And now we're in a place of like palliative care, where we are still providing and trying to get to the best result possible in a really dire situation. Even before the pandemic, we were not able to educate our students. We had 90, 80% graduation rates, but 30% proficiency rates when it came to reading. So now that we're in the remote learning or online learning space, we have to have a level of honesty about even our ability to educate children when we were in person. I think sometimes when we're in the remote space, we can have these false positives as we're making growth, because now kids have a computer, or now kids aren't on packets, or now kids are checking in with their teacher. But we're not really asking the question, are they receiving excellent education in that space, or do they just have a computer in front of them now? Or are they just, and so I think we always have to be mindful of what is the experience that students are having, and how is that experience impacting their overall proficiency, their overall growth, their ability to be independent, agentic thinkers. I think that's one of the challenges that we have. But when it comes to improving remote learning, I think the first thing we have to really understand is what's the role of the teacher? When a child is interfacing with a teacher, what do I need that teacher to be doing? And in my opinion, it's not always doing the direct instruction. Children have a level of independence and agency that they can do a lot of like self-guided learning on their own with video recordings, reading through packets, reading through texts, grappling with problems, calling their peers or colleagues and asking them questions. But when it really comes to my time with a teacher in either a remote or distance learning space, that really be where my learning is taken to the next level. I'm getting feedback on my understanding. I'm being pushed. I'm having a higher level of questioning that's happening. And so I think it really is for us refining not only like how we want to use asynchronous versus synchronous learning in the remote space, but also how our teachers need to be utilized. And I think a real undercurrent of some of the challenges that we're having right now is that for years, decades even, I would say, we were really cultivating a lot of dependency from our students where teachers were the primary conduits for education and instruction in the classroom. And so now what we're faced with is when we need our students to have a level of independence, they're struggling in the remote space because every day in classrooms, we were sitting down with students and we were saying, you know, now turn to page 3. Now I'm going to tell you what page 3 says. I'm going to read it to you. I'm going to tell you my answer for page 3. I want you to write down my answer for page 3. And now that can't exist in the remote space. We have to have a level of independence, a level of grappling, a level of agency. And if we don't cultivate that all the time, we're running into some of the issues that we're seeing in the remote space as well.
Can I comment on that? Because I
Sure, go
think
ahead,
what Jamila is saying makes a lot of sense. I think that the pandemic is kicking America into the future as it relates to education, literally kicking us into the future.
Wow.
And that future is in part based on technology. And by the way, I don't think the answer is full-time virtual education. I think blended, the hybrid, as you mentioned, Charles, will be the default place that most school districts should and will go to. But this idea of how we educate, particularly the most challenged group of kids, and we serve a lot of them, and I, you know, having represented Ward 7 in DC, I know those schools well. Jamila is absolutely right. Right now, kids don't have to worry about content. We all have content. So this stand and deliver lecture approach that was the hallmark of ed schools for the last 150 years is kind of going to be passé going forward. What we have to have teachers, they're more of like the guide for learners and have them be able to understand how to problem solve and process and prioritize the content that's easily available to them. That's part of what our teacher training is about. And I think in a remote space, utilizing project-based learning where kids can work together online to solve problems, and you have mastery of skills associated with the curriculum in ways where you can deliver a quality education to kids and they feel empowered to be part of the solution. The last thing I'll say, because I really want to make sure that those of you who have kids and talk to school districts about how to use parents. Parents are so important in this. And I think one of the first things we tell parents in our Learning Coach University, look, put your kids on a schedule. For younger kids, less time in front of a computer, more time with the reading material and the textbooks. For older kids, as Jamila alluded to, and I think Senator Lockman, your daughter, they're more self-directed. They can have more time on the computer, but make sure you put breaks in between every hour. Make sure there's time for physical activity. Make sure there's time for the gamification. I mean, the good news is that kids intuitively connect with this, but they still need adults to help shape and guide their experience as they navigate through their educational situations.
Yes,
Yeah.
I agree really strongly. And I think prior to serving my district, I came from a parent engagement background. So I started out as a parent advocate and, did PTA and ran an organization for parents in vulnerable communities to connect them to the system. And I think this does really highlight a gap that we already knew existed in terms of how do we connect parents to the system and help them understand what the tools are and what they need to know, what's at their disposal to best support their students. And now they're carrying a lot more of that load. And, I was going through some Facebook posts with some of my constituents and seeing them talking about exactly that. They feel now like they are volunteer educators and having, that have received no training and are receiving very, very little support to play that role. And I think that, that's a gap we've always needed to bridge. And it's not necessarily one that can be bridged with technology, but I think it just really points out to us how important it is for us to invest resources in shoring up parent capacity and connecting parents as partners in the educational process. So I think that's a major growth area that we need to do in conjunction with blended learning.
Thank you for mentioning that too, Senator and Representative. Yeah, like but it's very tough. It's a very tough ask for parents during pandemic time. We've got many parents, many households going through permanent unemployment, especially Black households, Black parents dealing with high rates of food insecurity. So, and then suddenly, they're being asked to be learning coaches in this brand new, unprecedented remote learning environment. But how can states, particularly as a state legislator, what are the policy prescriptions to help fill that kind of gap?
I mean, I'll jump in here. Using a famous line, the reality check here is we can't legislate our ways out of some of these challenges that we've been faced with for so many years. So of course we need money, we need the will, we need leadership. So that starts with our superintendents, it starts with our commissioners of education, and also our districts jumping in and saying, okay, we've got to be nimble, we've got to be innovative, and it can't be the same, business as usual model. And as a parent of two growing girls, while I'm not an educator, I work in the field of education, and our parents are struggling. And I just felt the need to underscore the importance of making sure our parents are true partners in this overall sort of new reality that we're faced with. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there's a right answer, but I do believe that everything that we've been talking about is vitally important. So as a state legislator, my goal and my responsibility is to advocate for more dollars and to ensure that some of my colleagues, whether they're Democrat or Republican, understand that this is not new to many of the communities that I represent. So Black and brown folks have been faced with this before we were talking about COVID. And now it's even more important for us to invest the dollars needed to bring our kids up to speed with everybody else. So I don't know if that's an answer that folks are willing to grapple with, but the reality is, man, we got a long way to go, and I am nervous as hell as we continue to move throughout this pandemic.
Hey, Frank, I want you to chime in real quick. I'll let others also. I noticed, Senator, you had a comment, but real quick, I want to get Frank's perspective on this because Representative Mcgee was talking about, Kevin made a statement about, hey, this is literally kicking America into the future. Which I thought was very interesting. That's an intriguing thought. And then Representative Mcgee was talking about the opportunity to innovate here, to be more nimble and agile. So do we see that happening, Frank? Where this is, it is forcing some. Maybe that's the silver lining in all of this, through all of the equity gaps, through all of the stress and strain that households are going through, and how school districts and students. Let's not forget about the students, because there's a lot of stress on young people. But maybe that's the silver lining here. It's forcing some new innovation and people, educators, looking at things differently and doing things differently than they ever have before. I
think it is true that we're moving education and it's pushing education into the future. I would also say there's, for as long as the 20-some years I've been in education, I've always said we have a tendency to preach the reality, or should I say preach the dream, but not support the reality. And so I think while in my other thing I always think about is that innovation in and of itself does not spur equity. Mm-hmm. I think we need to reverse that, and equity needs to spur innovation. Because like he said, non-white school districts get $23 billion less than white school districts. So it's always been a problem. And we don't like to say the word sometimes, but this idea of systemic racism or systemic inequities, we've been preaching this for years. I think what this pandemic has done is that it's made it so that people can't turn away from it. They can't turn their blinders off. And so now these are things that now we have to grapple with. We have a values gap. Because like you said, we've talked a lot about parent engagement. Parents always wanted to be engaged. I would tell you, I was in Chicago. Black and brown parents are some of the most engaged parents that you can come across. All they want is for their kids to do better than them. They've always asked to be engaged in schools. The problem now is we want parents to be engaged, but we want them to be engaged on our timeline. And we want them to do the things that we think they should do. I think I shared with you before, the two professions that people never worked in their life, but they feel comfortable telling people what to do. And that was parenting and that was teaching. And so
Right.
we can move forward. And I see that we're going forward, but we can move forward with the technology, but then we can't forget about the equity issues that we've been dealing with since the beginning of this United States. Otherwise, it's going to be the same.
Yeah, yeah. Senator, you had a thought earlier.
Well, yes, I just wanted to piggyback a little bit for the representative. I think he was totally on point. But in terms of that investment, I was going to hearken a little bit, I think, also to what Frank was saying, which is, there's ways, I think, for us to invest in building relationships. And I think we know that we've struggled to have coherent, effective relationships between sometimes our public school institutions in particular, and our families and our Black and Brown communities. And I do believe as policymakers, there's ways for us to offer resources and to facilitate conversations with our districts, and to what does it look like to build those relationships effectively, and to invest resources in, tools and probably human resources to bridge those gaps. So that's a conversation that's been happening in my community. And I think it's just one thought, is it organizers? Is it employing organizers to authentically build relationships between what are seen as sort of these government service entities and communities, and make sure it's a two-way street. So like Frank was saying, that it's a conversation instead of just a prescriptive, parents do this. It's more, what do we need to be together to educate our children?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. And look, Dr. Getchers, I stand shoulder to shoulder with you on this idea of equity in terms of funding, access, making sure there's fair accountability, not just accountability is hammered over people's heads. It doesn't make sense. Equal opportunity, systems that don't punish teachers who teach at-risk kids, supporting HBCUs, supporting Black and Brown. I'm with you. But I think this issue of how we best help parents help themselves, information is power. So when I talk about, things that I think parents can do, it comes from the vantage point of working with thousands of parents who have helped develop the questions that they want answers to. And these are the tools that I think anyone who's a school provider should work with parents to arm them, because to be forearmed is to be forewarned. I mean, you know what you need. And one of the things that we have seen with parents who had no technological skills, never had a computer before, many of whom didn't even have a high school diploma, that strength comes in numbers. So by connecting parents, we have this mentoring relationship where we connect some parents who've experienced the technology, maybe had a couple kids go through our program, with those who haven't. Now you see, and you've read about it in the newspaper, these parent pods that are emerging because some families can't, don't have the bandwidth because they're working to be a learning coach for their children. So you may see they connect with 2 or 3 other families in their kids' classroom, and there's a central spot where they all get together and with the kids, and one person is the main guide for all of them, and we help with that training. So I think that we just have to build a community around supporting parents, teachers, and learners.
Yeah, and then Jamila, and I'm going to get to a couple of questions from audience members, but Jamila, in building that support system for parents, for teachers, for school districts, one other conversation I'm hearing frequently come up, whether it's in Philadelphia, whether it's in Washington, D.C., or Los Angeles or elsewhere, is everyone seems to be on the same page about this, everyone not receiving enough support from broadband companies. There's this need for like broadband, as now there's a recognition of broadband being essential, ubiquitous infrastructure. And people get the sense that, oh, hey, you know what? It's really not, but it needs to be as ubiquitous and as accessible as streets and bridges and highways. And so people are feeling like that's a big missing part of the puzzle. But how do we make some headway in that particular struggle? Because now that's a constant debate and conversation that's coming up. Is it an important part or piece of this conversation, Jamila?
I think it absolutely is. I think, you know, back during the Obama administration, that was one of his big initiatives, was expanding broadband access throughout the country into rural sectors. People poo-pooed it as like, you know, this isn't the thing we need right now. This is not the most urgent issue. And now we're in it. You know, I would say what my mama would say there, but I'm just gonna keep it but we're in it, and we're looking around like, oh my God, you know, now we need broadband access. Like, and it's not just a rural issue. I mean, I live in the city of Memphis, Tennessee, and we still have a significant number of students here in the middle of a city in the United States that do not have access to internet, Wi-Fi, technology to an extent. And I do think, in terms of what Representative Mcgee was speaking to, it is going to require everyone in the community, everyone in the ecosystem doing their part and playing their role. But I think one of the challenges that we have is right now, we aren't defining people's lanes. We've had this issue for a number of years. We've been divesting and defunding education for a number of years, but expecting educators and education systems to pick up the slack for all of the wraparound services that we know we need, be it broad, like I have superintendents, chiefs of staff running around trying to figure out broadband access for all of their students. Is that really the role that I want my principals and my instructors to be playing at this particular time? Or they're trying to secure food services for families that are food insecure. Those are things that I think lawmakers, policymakers, other community leaders should be handling at this time. And I feel like what we're asking our educators to do is do everything but educate during the pandemic. We're asking them, the reason that we don't have time to focus on, you know, can our children read? Can they do the problem solving? Is because I'm trying to make sure they have lights on. I'm trying to make sure they have broadband or Wi-Fi access. I'm trying to make sure they have a jetpack if they need that. I'm trying to make sure they have paper and pencil, like all the things but my job as an educator. And so I think when we have this broadband access conversation, it's whose lane is that? Is that the educator's lane? Is that the principal's lane? Is that the superintendent? It shouldn't be. It should be our policymakers. It should be our community leaders. It should be our advocates. But we have had a hard time in this country of defining the roles and the lanes that we want people to play in when it comes into education, which is only causing our students to suffer.
I'm going to go to questions. So hold on one second, Representative. Before you hold that thought, I just want to make sure I get some, because we got a few questions from audience members. In fact, and one of those questions from your colleague in the Connecticut State Legislature. So I want to make sure we get that. And people can still submit questions in the Zoom group chat. Do so. That's how we are facilitating questions or even comments. If you have comments based on some of the discussion that we've been hearing here this morning during our Equity Gap Micro Summit, which is being once again presented by the Council of State Governments, Eastern Regional Conference Council on Communities of Color, in partnership, in conjunction with K-12 Incorporated. I'm Charles Ellison, by the way. Normally, I'm your host moderator for this discussion. I'm also the executive producer of these micro summits, but I'm normally host, executive producer, creator of Reality Check, daily public affairs program on WURD radio. You can catch me at Ellison Report on twitter.com, #Reality Check, if you'd like to leave comments there as well. State Representative Robin Porter at Connecticut, Kevin, was referring to when you had mentioned adaptable curriculum as it relates to emergency planning preparedness. Can anyone speak to the idea of creating curriculum tailored specifically for Black and Brown students, especially in a time like this? Anyone can jump in on that.
Yeah, well, I can tell you that one of the things we've done as part of our diversity initiative in the wake of the horrific death of George Floyd is we're creating a more specialized African-American curriculum, and that will be used online in our schools. And what we want to do is get that out to school districts around the country. We have found that our curriculum, which was established 20 years ago, like many schools' curriculum, isn't as up to date or relevant for many of today's kids. And if we are going to be having more of our kids be educated, particularly on their history and their standing in the world online, then we need to make sure those of us who are responsible for providing this curriculum to students, we need to make sure that it's relevant. So we're very, very aggressive about that. And I think that all school districts really should take a closer look at the curriculum, particularly the imagery. And it could be from the poets or literature sources they use, to the historical references. All of those things need to be upgraded and timely used in a way that benefits today's kids.
Go ahead, Senator.
Sure, just briefly, I think that's something that comes up a lot. I'm co-chair of a body that I formed with Representative Nnamdi Chukwucha, who I think has been to some of your conversations, called the Reading Consortium for Educational Equity. And so curriculum and educator diversity comes up a lot. And I think one of the possibilities that we're seeing, I think, with the remote learning orientation is that while we're struggling to diversify our educator workforce, there's this opportunity for technology to give us access to great educators of color who can effectively deliver these curricula on this curricula, you know, even while we may not have that person to be physically in the space yet. And so that's one of the things I feel us opening ourselves up to as a possibility that is a benefit of remote learning and access to technology that could be really cool.
Representative Mcgee, you had a statement or something you wanted to say. I don't know if you want to still follow up on that, maybe address that question that your colleague, Representative Porter. Thank you, Representative Porter. How are you doing? She had asked as well.
Yeah, thank you, Rep. Porter. And actually, I think my colleagues have done a great job responding to that. I am not by any stretch of the imagination an expert on curricular development, so I'll leave that to them. But I did want to make a comment in regards to Jamila talking about stakeholders sort of playing their roles during this pandemic and providing whatever resource they could potentially provide. I know here in the state of Connecticut, many of our faith-based institutions have established these learning sort of hubs. I know you mentioned pods earlier, where they've partnered with various stakeholders to provide resources, namely around connectivity, technology, et cetera, to many of our families in some of the most vulnerable districts. But I would say, or will say, that financial resources have been a challenge, right? So you get some dollars from the foundation or a really nice, worthy person who fills for our communities. They give us these resources, but sustainability becomes a challenge. And I'm just wondering, from some of our colleagues on this panel, what other recommendations or advice that you could give to states like Connecticut as we pursue many of these innovative ideas in response to the pandemic?
I'd like to hear from Jamila, but one thing that I think is real important, when she talks about staying in your lane, like it or not, many teachers are going to have to teach kids who suffer from the trauma associated with poverty. And so one of the charges I put to all of our schools around the country, I want every one of our schools to be trauma-informed schools. There's a process that the teachers and the staff go through so they know how to engage students that are hungry or nutritionally deficient. And I think that there's a certain science to engaging kids who are at risk. And many teachers are really great at it, but the training helps. Again, it's like giving tools. And I think that we need to have more and more of that. I think every school in America should be a trauma-informed school. It's a significant certification process. And it is, even though the lane of teachers should not be providing social services, you still have to be able to connect with and form relationships with kids who come from those kind of environments. So I think that's a big thing that everyone should push for.
Yeah. Let me go to these questions. I've got a few of them, which I really appreciate from audience members, and they seem to be tuning into this and really listening intently to this conversation, which is what we want here. I have a question from Chris G. I appreciate that. You're welcome, Chris. He says, organizing the session. Chris G is a Canadian And he says, it seems that our experiences are just more moderate versions of what's happening in the US. The pandemic is amplifying the social, economic, and educational gaps between rich and poor on both sides of the border. As Jamila said, it's not just technology. Students from low-income communities disproportionately do not have the social education capital or even the fundamental educational skills to be successful online. So is there a plan to help students from low-income communities catch up after the pandemic is over? I don't think we talked enough about that, right? Anyone want to jump in? Jamila, you know, since Chris was referencing something you had said earlier.
Yeah, I think first our plan is waiting until after the pandemic, then we failed. So I think we've actually got to dig in now with students who are behind. I would pointedly say, I don't think we should focus this on low income students, because there are students who are in low income communities or in low income households that are doing swimmingly well and have the necessary tools to do well in this situation, as well as when they're in person learning. But I do think what we need to be doing as a country is looking more closely at how students are faring within the pandemic, how they were doing before the pandemic. I think we have enough data since No Child Left Behind 10 years ago. We have enough data on students to really be able to ascertain students who are at risk in the pandemic. And we need to make sure that we have touch points with adults for those students in particular, that they have time one-on-one, that they have time in small groups to really engage and dig in with their educators and get supported practice. But I think that there are some just gaps that we have in teacher understanding and proficiency. The number of teachers that don't necessarily have an understanding of the science of reading, how to train and support students who are not proficient in reading and build that skill with them. Teachers who don't have necessarily the knowledge, and teachers will say this readily, I'm not kind of outing anybody, that I don't have the necessarily the professional development I needed to be able to scaffold or differentiate for students who are behind. So we do need to really build up and have teacher training programs that provide that skill building for teachers of understanding how do you support a middle school student who is currently reading on a 3rd grade level? What is that process? What are those interventions? What are those practices that really work? How do you build a student's ability to problem solve? How do you build a student's ability to read and write? If we don't have that knowledge in our schools, in our school systems, where it feels not daunting, but just a regular part of our practice, or not an add-on. Oftentimes we have this myth of the average that we train our teachers around, where you're going to walk into every single classroom, they're going to be proficient, they're going to be on grade level, they're going to have is their first language. That's just not the reality that most classrooms are in our country. Most classrooms have students who are below grade level. Many classrooms have students who have an IEP. Many classrooms have students who who English was not their first language. But we don't equip teachers to actually deal with the realities that they are facing. So I think it's about our teacher preparation programs. I also think it might be about us rethinking the teacher role. As Councilman has said, this is kicking us into a new era. And for so long, we haven't had an opportunity to really rethink what is the role of the teacher. And I've seen a lot of systems that I'm working with really start thinking about, like, maybe every teacher doesn't need to be working with 23 kids every single day. Maybe I just have some of my teachers working with a small group of students who are really strong with reading intervention, and they're helping those students that way. Or maybe I'm deploying my teachers who provide English language development across the district, as opposed to having them housed at one school. So I think it allows us to have a level of flexibility, but I think in terms of supporting kids who are behind, our first thing that we need to really do is make sure that teachers understand what research and evidence has shown. And what research and evidence has consistently shown is that you move in and help students improve if you give them grade level assignments the majority of the time. But often what we do when we see kids who are behind, we lower the rigor level, we lower the expectation, we give them something that feels like it's right on their level, as opposed to making them grapple with grade level materials. And so that needs to be our goal, is giving kids grade level materials, but then simultaneously helping teachers understand the practices and the instructional behaviors that it takes to ensure that students have access and can actually do and be successful on those grade level materials.
Got it. I know we're right at 11 o'clock. I want to make sure, hold on one second, Frank. I want to see if you all can give me several more minutes so we can, because I know people have some more thoughts. How's everyone's time? Everyone looking okay? We can go on for maybe another 5-10 minutes. And I know we got 1 or 2 more questions in the Zoom group chat. I appreciate that. Thank you. Frank, no, go ahead. And then I'm going to go to a question from an audience member.
So I think to get to the issues around equity, we had a chance in PESF to visit Ontario, Canada, and they were really taking an approach where they're operationalizing racial equity within the system. And what that really required was leadership at every level to be on board with what that meant. And so I think that's one of the things here in the US that we kind of struggle with, is the leadership on all of the different levels being on the same page around addressing issues of equity. And I want to say, I think to Jamila's point, one of the things she pointed to, if we think about it systemically for teachers, is teacher preparation. I think I shared that my bachelor's is in early childhood. My master's was in child development, but in early childhood, they didn't teach me to be a reading specialist. And so there's this idea around the science of teaching. And so it's sort of a general reading specialist is a special certificate. And so a lot of teachers are not coming to the classroom being reading specialists, or for that fact, math specialists. And so even in thinking about research, this is another challenge here in the US. There are so many different pathways in the US to become a teacher. There's not a standard definition of what it means to be a high qualified teacher. I just say pointedly, in Finland, teachers are researchers and they have to have a master's degree to become a teacher. So I agree that teachers need to do research, but when we look at it systemically and how we prepare teachers and all of the different pathways to become a teacher and how all of those pathways do not have the same criteria, then we put ourselves in a situation that we're in today. But we're asking teachers to do a lot, and then some are going to do it well and some are not. And again, as we move to the future, we're going to look the same.
Speaking of Ontario, Canada, I know we have actually tuning in right now, Michael Couteau. He's a member of the provincial parliament in Toronto, Canada, and a former minister of anti-racism in Canada. And Michael, we're going to bring you on. You had a question, but since you're here and since Frank just mentioned Ontario, Canada, if you wanted to offer a real quick insight for us from a Canadian perspective across the border. Toronto, fantastic place, by the way, too, and I can't wait to get back to Caribana. So really appreciate your time on here, and folks from Canada being on today. But and feel free to ask your question too. How are you doing, Minister?
You know, I'm doing well, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. I found this conversation very enlightening, and appreciate the work that the organization is doing. In Toronto, back in 2006, at the Toronto District School Board, which is the largest school board in Canada and third largest in North America, I believe, still, about 250,000 students, we started to collect disaggregated race-based data. It was very controversial, but it passed by 1 vote. And you know, many years later, now it's embedded into legislation, anti-racism legislation in Ontario, that mandates public education to collect that type of data. So my question is this: how important is the collection of disaggregated race-based data in this new environment we're in, where we're seeing rapid advancements in technology and more online learning and blended hybrid learning? And you know, what role will it play in ensuring equity? Because we know, without a question, we don't have to take data, you know, collect data to understand the inequities that exist within the systems. We can see it. But I think with the technology opportunity that's presented itself, there will be a role for the collection of data. And I just wanted to find out, is there a conversation happening in America? And if so, you know, what is the position of different governments and educators in regards to this issue?
You know, Kevin, I'd like you to first touch on that question, and then Senator and everyone else, if you can jump in on it. But Kevin?
Yeah, so I think that just as education is being refashioned, I believe that education systems as a whole need to be refashioned. And the power and potential of the online experience, I know Senator Lockman talked about being able to use diverse teachers online, that they could access thousands of kids instead of just a handful. I think that if we fashion education the right way, the power in the online experience, the power of the online experience can help explode some of the racial and socioeconomic biases we see in education. Mm-hmm. Now that's the potential, but it really comes down to us having a commitment to working with our teachers and our stakeholders and our parents to make them a part of the discussion. Because my fear is, having been in government, is you have sort of the learned leaders, shaping this in a way that doesn't take into account the needs of the people on the ground. I think that online learning can be the great equalizer when applied the right way. And I think that data that you're talking about, socioeconomic, racial data, can help be a guidepost to make sure you utilize equity in a more reasonable and meaningful fashion. One last thing I want to say, because Dr. Gettridge alluded to it, and I keeps ringing in my ear. When we deal with teachers, again, I've got 8,000 teachers in my system. We have to refrain from dealing with teachers in a punitive way. And I really feel like one of the things we did, real quick, Charles, we created the first of its kind Masters in Virtual Education Teaching, partnering with Southern New Hampshire University. We know where there's a salary gap, but we also know that most states, when you get that additional certification, micro-credentialing or master's or your doctorate, you get additional dollars. And we enrolled 300 of our teachers around the country in the first ever Masters in Virtual Education Teaching courses. And we want to do more of that, because I think the more teachers feel empowered to own this space, then we can have a more meaningful and robust and realistic outcome for kids. And I talk about that because, to your point, Mr. Minister, I think teachers and parents have to be at the center of how we use data that describes our kids and their needs.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Kevin. Oh, go ahead, Senator.
Sure, but I was just going to really reinforce that point. I think, the conversation about data and how we use it and how we measure and how we interpret those measures and sort of telegraph that, particularly to our community members, is, it's really important, but it's also a shifting one. And I think early in our conversation, Dr. Guttridge, and then Councilman Chavis reinforced that, it's how do we use it? Are we using it in a way that's a punitive form of accountability, or that it is about support and growth? And I think the big conversation we've been having in my community, especially with the consortium that I co-chair, is, we're digging in to do more disaggregation and have a better understanding of disparities across communities, and particularly across these different districts that touch the same communities. And we're also having a lot of conversations about, are we measuring the inequity of inputs as much as we're measuring the inequity of outputs where it comes to how we're serving our children? So we're still trying to figure out, what data are we even looking at? To what extent is it telling us what we think it's telling us? And I'm feeling personally, at least among my legislative colleagues, a shifting in that conversation. I don't know where it's going to end up, but I definitely feel a difference from what we saw several years ago in terms of the accountability and data conversation.
Since we're talking about another, 5 or 10 minutes of people's time, Minister, if you can stay on there too, because maybe you can offer some insights to a couple more questions we had here. We have Mitzi Hunter. Welcome, Mitzi. She was saying thank you for the panel discussion today. I completely agree that we need to drive ambition and excellence in the system and allow students to learn the tools to grapple with grade level material instead of passing through. Actually, Mitzi Hunter is a member of Parliament out of Scarborough, Guildwood, Ontario. So thank you, Member Hunter, for joining us. Really appreciate that. Representative Robin Porter out of Connecticut had another question here. This is a question piggybacking from Lois R's statement. Well, I should read Lois, the audience member, her statement first. She was saying, from the teachers I have spoken to, there is a concern about students who really need hands-on and limited time for instruction. And so Representative Robin Porter was asking, what suggestions would the panelists make to address that concern as it specifically relates to special needs students? That is a very good question. Anyone can jump in on this. Yeah, go ahead, Frank. A special needs student, is that something that's come up, or is something that we've been thinking about more?
Yes, it's actually the area where people feel like there hasn't been enough conversation.
Yeah.
To be honest with you, and parents.
Yeah, I noticed there was a little pause of silence when I even when I dropped it. Yeah, and that's not to fault this panel, but I haven't heard a lot about that conversation either.
Right, and so it's really looking at what does it mean for a child to get the amount of minutes that they need, and how, again, expecting the parent to now become an expert or to become an educator around facilitating instruction for students with special needs. Parents are learning how to be advocates for their children, but now they have to become teachers for their children. And so I think that's an area that hasn't been discussed a lot. And even when we think about the IDEA Act, it's been underfunded for years. And I think so we have to look at like reing up what's needed for parents to have that support, be it in the home or be it within the schools once we return back to that blended learning model. What will it look like? It hasn't been discussed enough, I'm going to be honest with you. And we need to get it
Let me
more
say quickly,
Go ahead,
we do a really good job with special needs kids for a couple of reasons. One is the online special needs teacher setting online with students allows for more of a personalized experience. And so we're able to first of all, help develop the IEPs and then follow the educational approach with more efficacy, because it is more of a one-on-one relationship, and the class sizes are much smaller. The second thing we're able to do is, because we're a national organization, and we're able to get better economies of scale with the proper providers that could help facilitate the support these kids need. So our schools don't have to rely on just a select group of providers in their local area. We get the best of the best to help support kids as we satisfy the terms of their individual education plan.
No, thank you for that, Kevin. Minister, I don't know if you want to add a final thought, or Jamil, I'll get to you in a second. Minister, go ahead.
So I went out actually and spoke to parents with autistic children right across the province. It was all online, and I did 10 consultations. And this was a file that governments today and in the past have all struggled with in regards to finding the right type of resources and aligning policy with the demand growth. But one of the things that parents kept saying was the need to take a step back and rethink the entire education system in this new reality and how it works with children with special needs, in particular, in this case, with children with autism. So I think governments need to work with school boards and educators to rethink the entire interaction that takes place between a child with special needs, his or her community, and family, and really aligning what's happening in the outside world, outside of schools, to what's happening within those schools, because a lot of those interactions don't exist in a very efficient way. So those are some of the things that parents brought forward.
Yeah. Thank you.
Can I add?
Real quick, I'm going to get something from Jamila real quick, Frank, before we close up. Go ahead, Jamila, because I think you were trying to say something before I cut you off earlier.
I think the conversation about students with learning and thinking differences is tied to the conversation about how we look at data. The partner over our impact and data team within TNTP, Bailey Cato, often references like JFK's famous, like, does the high tide raise every boat? And I think sometimes we implement systems and structures we can assume that, because all of our numbers went up by 10%, that this was successful for all students equitably, as opposed to really cutting the numbers by different demographics to understand, did it have the same impact across the board that we would want? So I think that's a really important thing. And it really links to this idea of understanding students with special needs. I think the conversation about students with in special education services or receiving special education services, we often go to the severe one-on-one student as our imagery of like what special education looks like during this time. But I'm equally as concerned about the 80% of students who are still held accountable for grade level materials, who have an IEP, which they have to meet grade level expectations, but they have a learning or thinking difference that means that they process information differently. Within this environment, it is incredibly difficult and challenging to support that. And so I think sometimes we're only thinking about, you know, the student who may need one-on-one services, but not the student who needs really practical instructional and instructional practices happening every day in their core instruction that they may not be able to get in this remote environment. I completely agree about the IDEA underfunding is something that we have to consider in this process. Many of our systems are already having to cut special education programming, special education teachers, special education support, paras, assistants, whatever it might be, which only further burdens our system when we have situations like this. But again, even if we were in person, they were struggling to meet the needs of students. And I think that's the thing that I want to just keep coming back to, that the challenges that we're seeing to provide adequate and accurate and effective special education support is not a manifestation of the pandemic. It was a challenge we were having even before the pandemic. So we can't rest on the laurels of like, once students are back in school, all of these things disappear, because they were still a challenge even when we were in brick and mortar buildings.
Yeah. Frank, closing thought?
Jamila caught it, and I would just add that we're back at the same issue. All of these ideas and strategies is going to take investments.
Yeah.
And as Jamila just mentioned, they're taking investments away from schools at a time when they're adding more accountability and expectations onto schools. And so until we decide that education deserves, and I mean early childhood education as well, because that's another point we didn't touch on today. But until we realize the investment that's needed and we're willing to put forth that investment, we will continue to be in the same situation. And it has to be with an equity lens. If we don't take care of our most underserved populations, then the rising tide won't lift all the boats.
Yeah. Any closing thoughts, anyone, before we shut this down?
Thank you.
All right.
No, great conversation.
Yeah, no, thank you all very much. Really appreciate this. Representative Brandon Mcgee, by the way, if everyone was watching, he had to leave early. He had another panel discussion, another forum that he had to, that he was scheduled for, and he had to join. So, but appreciate his presence nevertheless. And thank you, Representative Mcgee, even though you're not here, but as you'll watch this later on, thank you for your time. Appreciate that. Delaware Senator Elizabeth Lockman, 3rd District of the state of Delaware, 3rd Legislative District, parts of Wilmington, joining us here on our Equity Gap Micro Summit. Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. And also we've had Kevin P. Chavis, who is President of Academic Public Affairs for K-12 Incorporated, K12.com for more information. They've been our partner, presenting you with this fantastic discussion, very enlightening discussion indeed, about remote learning. Is it just for a pandemic, or is it just for the future? I think we all agreed that this is kind of here to stay. And that's not actually such a bad thing, but we're going to have to adapt to it. We got a lot of work to do, a lot of innovation needed. Councilman Chavis, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Jamila Newman is partner at the New Teacher Project, tntp.org. Fantastic insights and conversation from you too, Jamila. So really appreciate your time and your additional time this morning as well. Dr. Frank London Gettridge is Executive Director of the National Public Education Support Foundation, npesf.org, for more information there. So, definitely appreciate your time. And then joining us as a later panelist is Michael Couteau, who is a member of the Provincial Parliament in Toronto, Canada. He's also the former Minister of Anti-Racism. I love that title, by the way. I have a colleague who was texting me, who's listening and saying, I love that title. Like we need a minister of anti-racism here in the United States. So we appreciate you, Minister Couteau.
Thank you.
Thank you. I also want to thank, this ended up being inadvertently, but pleasantly a cross-border conversation. Some of your colleagues from the provincial parliament in Ontario have been watching in and joining us. Chris Glover, member of provincial parliament in Ontario, also there. We appreciate that. And Tony Ince, who is the Minister of African Nova Scotian Affairs and the Public Service Commission in Nova Scotia. Thank you, Minister Ince. He's also been chiming in and joining us. So Canadians watching what's unfolding here in the United States very closely. We appreciate that. We appreciate it, Minister Couteau, for you joining us. We didn't expect you, we didn't plan on that, but it worked out.
I'm kind of like the Raptors. You didn't expect them to win the championship, but
Right.
here we are.
Didn't expect it, right?
We show
right.
up once in a while.
Every once in a while,
right?
yeah.
That was last year, right?
So, all right. No, I appreciate that, and hopefully I'll see you in Toronto next year. On the other side of this thing. Toronto's a beautiful town. My family and I, we always enjoy it. So thank you for joining us. Everyone, thank you. I'm Charles Ellison. I am the host, the moderator, executive producer of these Equity Gap Micro Summit discussions. We've been focused on remote learning. Remote learning, is it the just for pandemic or is it the future? This has been brought to you by the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, Council on Communities of Color. There's the director of the Council on Communities of Color, Debbie Ann Page. She's done a fantastic job. She is the wizard behind the curtains, making this all possible. So I want to thank her as well. Also other folks who've been tuning in and watching, really appreciate you. Appreciate some of the thoughtful questions from folks. Thank you, State Representative Robin Porter. Always good to have you join in and chime in and watch these discussions. She's been on a couple of these panels as well, and appreciate everyone's time. Go to #RealityCheck. I'm also at Ellison Report on Twitter.com. Feel free to please tune in to Reality Check on WURD Radio, which is another one of our partners as well, every Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern. So you can just do the live stream at Word Radio, WURDradio.com, Word TV at Facebook.com/4Word as well. All right, we're wrapping this up. Thank you, everyone. I want to give you back your weekend, your Friday afternoon. I'm Charles Ellison signing off. Everyone have a great afternoon, a good evening, a good weekend. Please, everyone, also be safe out there. Take care.
Okay. Thanks, Charles. Thanks, Debbie Ann. Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Debbie, you can stop recording too.
Got it.